Welcome to the Neighborhood Law Center. I'm your host, Melvin Burris, and our guests today are Lori Ann Douglas, whose practice and specialty is trust, and Arlene Dubin, whose specialty is matrimonial family law. Okay. Counselors, could you tell the audience a little bit about yourselves?
Sure. Now, I've been practicing matrimonial law for over 25 years. I'm a partner at Moses and Singer in New York City. I'm co-chair of the matrimonial department, and I've written a book called Prenups for Lovers, A Romantic Guide to Prenuptial Agreements.
Okay. Counselor.
Okay, and I am a partner at Moses and Singer as well. My primary practice is in the Trust and Estates Department. My background was as a New York County District Attorney, and so when I left the DA's office many years ago now, I started in Trust and Estates, and in addition to estate planning, estate administration, I also handle estate litigation matters because of my litigation background.
Okay, well, looks like we're going to have a great program today. Okay, our topic is same-sex marriage and unsolved issues. And the reason we're getting into this area is because most recently New York recognized same-sex marriages. Has there been a rush in this area to marriage among same-sex couples?
Absolutely, a mad rush. The law was enacted and effective July 24th, which was a Sunday. But many couples got married on the stroke of midnight on Saturday night. They got all their ducks in order. They did, they had the vows, they had the marriage license, they got their waivers, and I actually attended one of those weddings. So there's been an incredible rush. In New York, there's a 24-hour waiting period normally to get married, but because there was so much excitement about the ability to marry after all of these years, that many judges volunteered to waive this waiting period. So people were able to get married on Sunday, and they did in record numbers. And I could understand this euphoria and pent-up demand for marrying because it was a privilege that had been denied to same-sex couples for so long. However, the message that I want to get out is that same-sex couples should slow down because the law is very complicated. As you said, there are a lot of unsolved problems and issues, and before you rush headlong into something as serious as marriage, you need to understand the effects of these laws on you and do some prenuptial planning and some estate planning so that you can maximize the benefits and minimize the disadvantages.
Okay. There's a requirement for residency, is there a requirement, I should say, for residency for same-sex marriages in New York?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Mel, because all these people got married as soon as they could, the first day they were able to under law. And many of them came from other states. They weren't just New York residents because there was no residency requirement to marry in New York. So that's great for same-sex couples who wanted to get married somewhere. However, the downside is that should these people ever want to get divorced, there is a residency requirement in New York, a minimum of 1 year, and then other requirements also have to be met. So supposing you have the situation where a couple came to New York and they married in New York and they go back to their home state.
Okay.
And maybe it didn't work out the way they anticipated it would work out. So they want to get divorced. The problem is that although New York has same-sex marriage and 5 other states do, and the District of Columbia does, that means most states don't have same-sex marriage, and most states don't recognize same-sex marriage. So if a state doesn't recognize same-sex marriage, clearly it doesn't recognize same-sex divorce. So what happens to these couples? They're basically totally in limbo. So people rushing headlong into marriage have to understand that should they ever want to unravel this union, there may be tremendous complications, especially today in our very mobile society.
Because you said New York has a registry for divorce. How long
Right.
how long is that?
There's 5 or 6 different bases for a residency requirement, but generally the minimum is a 1-year residency requirement, plus something else like having been married in New York or having lived in New York as a married couple.
Okay. So what other implications do we have? I mean, as you're talking about, there's only 5 states in D.C. which recognize same-sex marriages. What are the implications there,
Well,
as far as health benefits are concerned?
Well, the biggest problem is not only that other states don't recognize the marriage. The biggest problem is that on the federal level, same-sex marriage is not recognized. So we have a law which is called the Defense of Marriage Act, which is a federal law, which basically says that marriage is only to be considered a union between a man and a woman. And if a union, therefore, between same-sex couples is not recognized on the federal level, which means that the entire panoply of federal benefits, including very beneficial tax consequences that are available to different sex married couples, are not available to same-sex married couples. Now, you mentioned health benefits. That's a very good case in point, because although many companies now will say we offer health benefits to married couples, and say if you're in New York or any one of the other states, you would be eligible as a married couple. However, on the federal level, if you're a married different sex couple, you will not pay, there will be no federal income taxes on the health benefits that's provided to your spouse. However, since the federal government doesn't recognize your marriage, you will get the health benefits if they're provided by your company, but you're not going to get the beneficial tax consequences. And this is not only in the health area, it's in every single area of the law.
Okay. And I just want to add, and similarly, it's the same on the estate side. So whatever estate planning you do as a married couple in New York, you will get the tax benefits available in New York if you die in New York, a same-sex married person.
Okay.
But you won't get the same federal benefits that married people get. And for state administration, what is significant is not where you got married, but where you are domiciled when you die. So if you die in a state that doesn't recognize the same-sex marriage at all, there are different rights and intestacy which will come into play and will make it difficult or may prevent the same-sex spouse to inherit without proper estate.
Who's going to explain the state and federal tax returns?
I can talk about
Okay.
that. I mean, it's quite a messy situation, because if you're a same-sex couple and you're married, you must file your income tax returns jointly as a married couple. You must, okay? If you are the state. However, on the federal level, since we just said the federal government doesn't recognize you as a married couple, you may not file as married jointly. To file your New York State income tax returns, it follows the federal return. So you have to prepare, if a same-sex couple has to prepare the federal return and then use the numbers off the federal return in order to prepare the state return. Okay. However, you're not actually filing that federal return. You'll have to do a different return, which is filing as
Because you have
a single taxpayer.
Because the first federal return you prepare as if you're married, filing
Right.
jointly, so that you can figure out your deductions and everything in the state. But then that one has to be ripped up because now you actually have to go file your federal as a
Right,
single.
so it's like a dummy federal income tax return that you file as if you were eligible to file as a married couple. But you're not eligible, so it's just really informational.
And that would be the same for estate tax. If a person dies, a married same-sex couple in New York, and they have a taxable estate, it could be taxable for New York state purposes, but there's also maybe a federal estate tax. You will not get the benefits that a married person would get in terms of federal estate tax, but you get the New York estate tax benefits. And you have to do the same thing, the dummy return for federal, and then you have to deal with the benefits that you will not get naturally as a married person under the federal law. You can plan to try to.
Okay, so we're saying that again, for divorce, it's not where you divorce is where you live at. That because you're married now in New York, to get a divorce from another state, you have to come back to New York to get a divorce.
Well, another state wouldn't be able to give you a divorce because they wouldn't recognize you were married.
Any state, presumably any state that recognizes same-sex marriage, the 6 states would.
When you die, if you die in another state other than New York, there's complications there because you're not legally married there. You're presumed to be
single, right? And in every state, if a person dies without a will, there's a state law of intestacy that determines. So if you're an adult and you're single and you have, adult children, or you don't have children but your parents are living, if you're a single person, the people that inherit your estate, the people that have rights under the law are either your children, and if no children, your parents. So if you die in a state that doesn't recognize the marriage, it could be that, unexpected heirs, family members, or whatever have now rights to your body, to your assets, to priority, to getting to be in charge of your estate in the court system. So it's very significant.
Which excludes your spouse.
It would exclude your spouse because under, in New York State, for example, a friend has no standing to become.
That's why it's important, I guess, as you're saying, to do a will or a trust if, in fact, you get married in New York and live in another state, because then you can dictate or let the world know how you want your assets distributed.
Correct. It's very important to do the will, but it's also important to make sure you have any other documents because, even if you do a will in New York, if you die domiciled someplace else, that New York will could be admitted to probate, but the state where you die may not recognize your marriage. And so therefore, while, your spouse may take as a legatee, somebody who you gave it to, they will not take as a spouse. And the spouses have certain rights under the law and tax benefits under the law.
Now, as a planning pointer, if same-sex couples enter into a prenuptial agreement, they can provide in this agreement that New York law will govern, which can be very helpful. You can also put in other supportive provisions, which may or may not work, saying that, if there's going to be a matrimonial dispute, the venue will be New York.
Okay, let's back up. Let's talk about the prenuptial.
It's prenuptial agreements.
What is it and how does it go?
Well, a prenuptial agreement is very simply an agreement between spouses to be, which basically lays out what will happen in the event of death or divorce. There's also a postnuptial agreement, which in New York and many states is similar to a prenuptial agreement. It lays out the rights and obligations in the event of death or divorce, but it's entered into after marriage. So that actually could be a solution to some of those same-sex couples that rush into marriage that we were talking about earlier. But if you haven't married yet, you can enter into a prenuptial agreement, and it has many benefits. One, I just mentioned, putting in your choice of law. That's usually considered, a boilerplate provision that doesn't have that much significance. But because of the variance of the law from state to state, it has a tremendous amount of significance, because you could move to another state, but if you have a prenuptial agreement that says that New York law governs, under most circumstances, that state is obligated to apply New York law. So that could be extremely
For the same-sex couple, right?
Yes,
That's
yes.
like contract. But
Right.
now, that's interesting now, because you're saying that if I make out a will in New York, when I go to another state, it may not be valid or not. But if I make out a contract in New York and I go to another state, that would be upheld.
For divorce, but not if you die intestate. So that's why it's very important to do the planning. So if a same-sex couple in a prenuptial agreement said, on the event of death, we agree that the surviving spouse gets everything, all assets. But then on death, they're domiciled someplace else, where they're now not treated as a married couple. They're treated as single people. Under that state's intestacy law, their legal heir, who is a descendant, either has to be your children, your parents, your siblings, the aunts and uncles, cousins. That's the order of distribution. Those people would have a right or a good argument to step in and say, I don't care what that contract says. Under our state law, you have died a domiciliary of this state without a will, and therefore under intestacy, I'm the mother, I take over. Okay. And they would be able to rush to the courthouse.
Let's underline without a will.
Without a will. That's why we're saying the prenup, all of that is important planning. If you don't do the planning.
If they marry in New York and they go to another state and they do a will,
right. Well,
that will has an effect.
It does, but it has an effect in terms of the state laws about about death, but not necessarily giving that surviving spouse any extra rights as a spouse. Spouses have certain rights. So in New York, for example, even if you make a will, if one spouse in a different sex marriage, if one spouse completely disinherits the other spouse under their will, which they can, the husband could say, I disinherit my wife completely under my will. In New York State, she has the ability to elect against that will. You cannot disinherit a spouse under New York State law. So at the time of the probate of that will, the wife can say, okay, forget that. I'm entitled to a third under law. So she can do a right of election. That different sex couple who moved to another state, they would be able to do that same thing. But a same-sex couple who does not have the benefit of that right of election could be completely disinherited, because there's nothing you can do. You'd have to make sure under that state law the person would be able to plan for the rights.
If the same-sex marriage is another state and they can't elect to. There's no election there for them because they're not recognized as spouses there.
Correct. That's the point. Exactly. That is the exact point. So, that's why you need to do a will to make sure.
Yeah.
Can we get back to the prenuptial agreement? Because a very important area in a prenuptial agreement is the area of spousal support, whether there will be any spousal support, or what's often known as maintenance or alimony in the event of the termination of the marriage.
That's in the prenuptial agreement.
That's always dealt with. Either it's waived or not waived, or it's quantified in some way. But the point I want to make is that under New York State and most state laws, the obligations of the wealthier party, the wealthier spouse, to the less wealthy party can be very hefty. These obligations are ameliorated somewhat by the fact that spousal support generally for different sex married couples is deductible. So in other words, I have a big payment that I have to make to my spouse, but the federal government is easing the blow a bit because it's going to be a deductible expense. However, now with the same-sex couple, I'm the wealthier party. I'm going to be whacked with the spousal support obligation under the law, but I'm not getting the federal tax benefit of the deduction, so I'm getting a double whammy
on your income tax.
I'm not getting a deduction on my income taxes, so it's actually more expensive than the state legislature even anticipated, because when they came up with this scheme, they thought that it was anticipated that it's going to be a deductible expense. So this is really a problem, and I think that when people realize this and negotiate the prenuptial agreement, they can take that into consideration. If the amounts are not going to be deductible to the payor and it's not going to be taxable to the recipient, then you've got to figure out something that's going to be more equitable. And you have an opportunity to do that when you're doing a private contract. But if you just go headlong into it without considering all the consequences, you can really end up in a very bad situation.
Because one of the things is, the second you say "I do," a spouse has rights.
Yeah.
And when you die, you automatically have some rights. Now you have rights. So unless you have in a prenuptial contracted something to do something different, it's automatic. So you can't do anything about it if you've married and you didn't,
The same issue with legal fees. I mean, it's presumed now, it's a relatively new law, that legal fees are going to be paid to the less wealthy spouse. So, I mean, you need to go, another example would be property transfers on divorce are normally tax-free. So if I have $500,000 and I owe you $250,000, that's going to be a tax-free transfer. However, remember, where the federal government doesn't recognize that. So my $250,000 that I'm giving to you, it's a gift. And I might have to pay gift taxes if it's above the exemption amount. Or if I'm using it against my lifetime exemption amount, I'm using it up when I shouldn't have been using it up.
Right. If you're a different sex couple, you wouldn't have to use these same. You would have more tax benefits.
Okay, let me
One
ask you
other
this.
thing,
Okay.
Social Security. Okay, if you're a spouse, you can get Social Security based on your husband's work history.
Oh wow. Okay.
Right?
Now we go back to the federal.
Now
again.
we're same-sex, couple. We don't get we don't get Social Security based on our spouse's work. So, I mean, it goes on and on.
Let me ask you this about the marital and separate property. Is there implications there?
Definitely. I mean, to make it real a complicated subject
Make
simple.
It simple.
I mean, there's a distinction in New York between what's considered marital property and separate property. Generally, separate property is what you acquire before the marriage, and what you acquire after the marriage by gift and inheritance.
That'll be in our prenups right off the bat.
Marital property would be what we earn during the marriage. Now, generally, under law, separate premarital property is not divided. However, with same-sex couples, most of them have lived together without the benefit of marriage because they couldn't marry for many, many years. So it may not really be the right thing. They might write a prenuptial agreement that says, this separate property that we built up together, if we have a divorce, we're going to share it. And that would be a variation from the law, which wouldn't be available to them if they didn't have a prenuptial agreement.
Okay. I asked you this question before, and I guess you were saying it doesn't make a difference whether you use a will or a trust in this situation of same-sex couples or marriage.
Right. The document or the way you transfer, whether it's in a revocable trust, whether it's pursuant to a will, whether it's pursuant to some other scheme, is not going to make much difference between different sex couples and same-sex couples. The difference is in your state. So in New York State, probate is very easy. It's streamlined. It's a nice process. So we do a lot of will-based planning. We put the trusts inside the wills in New York State because probate is not a terrible, unless there's some particular circumstance a person has, they have missing heirs or they don't want it to be a public record. So we do a lot of trust-based planning both in the will. In other states, their probate system may be complicated or it might not be effective. So Florida is a state where people usually use revocable trusts over wills because of the probate system. So that issue is really determined by your state law, and then you would get to the next level of whether the same-sex marriage is recognized or not or whatever, and how to deal with the federal exemptions and the different benefits that will not be available to the same-sex married couple, but you could contract to the extent that you can, basically through your agreements and wills and whatever, to get the benefit.
All right, look like we're running out of time. It was a great conversation here, but before we leave, could you tell our audience, sum up what you think our audience should know about this area?
The basic message would be to slow down and consult with advisors on prenuptial planning and estate planning so that you understand your rights and obligations and the potential complications of a marriage, and you can maximize the benefits and minimize the detriments.
Okay.
I agree with that. What we'd like for all of our clients is to plan, either do the prenuptial agreement or do the will or do whatever is the planning. But in the event that you haven't done any planning, then it's also very important with same-sex couples are thinking about divorce to really seek an advisor early to see what your rights are and in your state. And a same-sex married couple, when somebody dies, it'd be very important to make sure you get proper estate counsel at the time of the death to make sure that the person, the surviving spouse, gets the benefits that they are entitled to the extent that they can, especially if you die outside of New York State or another state that recognizes same-sex marriage.
Okay, to same-sex marriages. Now that you can get married, should you? And I guess what I'm trying to say is, you should talk to our advisors here. And if you could give me a telephone number, we appreciate it, how to get in touch with you.
My number is 554-7651. That's 212-554-7651.
Okay. And I'm Melvin Burris, and our guest has been Arlene Dubin and Lori Ann Douglas. And we'd like to thank you for watching. We'll see you next week. And remember to go to our website, www.neighborhoodlawcenter.com. Peace and God bless. Thank you.
I think,